Hi, everyone. I'm Dirta Alikay. I'm an advisory solution consultant in risk resilience and ESG here at ServiceNow, based in London, UK. My expertise is in financial services, where I provide guidance and support to a diverse range of clients. I've been conducting a series of webinars focusing on integrated risk management, GRC. This is the fourth session. Throughout this webinar series, we explore how ServiceNow platform goes beyond the traditional boundaries of GRC, and how it can empower organizations to transform their risk management and compliance processes. Today, we will demonstrating advanced risk assessment, how you can do data-driven assessment or automated risk assessments. With me, I have the pleasure of being joined by my Stephanie Mrakovic, and I will hand over to Steph to introduce herself as well.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. Good evening. My name is Stephanie Mrakovic, and I'm a solutions consultant within our risk business unit based out of Canada. So I cover all of our customers across Canada, spanning all the different industries. I'm really excited for this assessment because as you start to think through what your program maturity and your roadmap can look like, and especially looking at, the current state of what's going on in the world, and being able to think about how we can not only make lives of people easier, but do it in a way that's going to reduce costs. It's a really important topic, I think, to start looking at how your program can mature. And so I'm really excited to show you what's available in terms of those advanced risk assessments to support you as you continue to mature your program. Now, just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. Everyone on the line is kept on mute, but if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. We're going to take a look at those as best as we can as we go through the session. We'll either answer them live or directly in the chat, and want to make sure that, of course, you're able to get your questions answered as you're seeing things and we're going through the solution. Today's session will be recorded and shared through the community after. At the end of the session, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey. If you don't mind just sharing your feedback, that would be fantastic. We want to be able to ensure these sessions are delivering value to you. And so anything that you can share with us in terms of feedback would be wonderful. Now, in terms of the agenda today, we want to just set the stage a little bit in terms of what embedding risk and resilience across the enterprise can look like, and what we're seeing from other customers that we're working with as well. From there, we'll talk about what are the key features of the advanced risk assessments. What do we mean when we say advanced risk assessments? So we'll give you some insight into what those capabilities are. And then from there, we'll dive right into the demonstration. I want to make sure that we get a lot of time to show you those workflows, the different options for what that could look like. So from there, we'll dive through that. And then, of course, if there are any other Q&As that we haven't gone through as we've gone through the session today, we'll leave some time as well for Q&A at the end. And again, for Q&A, just make sure that you're using that Q&A feature. The chat helps if you just want to kind of communicate, but if you have specific questions, Q&A will ensure that we don't miss that and that we can actually answer your question. All right. So as we start to think about, what risk and resilience looks like across the organization, I think it's important to think through what that framework looks like, what the ecosystem looks like, and how that actually can be integrated in a platform like ServiceNow. A lot of you who are on the line today are probably familiar a bit with ServiceNow in terms of your organization might already use it for solutions like IT ticketing or customer service management, HR management, for example, or other IT workflows. The ServiceNow platform is quite a flexible platform that serves many different use cases. And what that means from a risk and resilience perspective is that there's actually a common data model that allows you to tap into that and leverage that information from a risk and resiliency perspective. So what do I mean by that? If we think through an example, traditional IT use case. You might have certain IT assets defined within ServiceNow. Those become entities or elements that we can start evaluating risk against or compliance against. Or for example, when we start thinking through something like security operations, that's information that can feed into understanding how our risk scores might change over time from a vulnerabilities perspective, or perhaps in terms of, managing your different employees and the different departments and BUs. You want to be able to evaluate risk against those, or understand what your control compliance looks like against your different business processes. A lot of this information may actually already be available in your ServiceNow instance today. And so you get to start using that as you build your framework from a risk perspective. The other thing that's important to highlight too that you see here on the screen is that when we talk about risk and resilience, we actually have several different use cases under that umbrella. So at the center, you'll see enterprise and operational risk, but in order to really have that beefed up program, you want to be able to understand what is the risk posture in terms of the third parties, the vendors, suppliers that we're working with, or what are we doing from a corporate compliance perspective, the different internal policies that we have that we need to align with, and as well as any regulatory frameworks, whether it be something like NIST or ISO, or from a privacy perspective, maybe GDPR as an example. Of course, all of these become important to understand holistically what our risk and resilience looks like. And so this is what we start to think through a true integrated solution can be, to actually have those different data points, not just across what data might be in ServiceNow or across your organization, but as well in terms of these different structures within risk and resilience, whether we're talking about operational risk, enterprise risk, third-party risk, business continuity. This all feeds into ensuring you can stay resilient and actually mitigate and manage risk. Now, in order to really make that seamless, it's important to be able to ensure that the user experience for everyone is smooth, right? For yourselves on the line, as you're managing your risk program, you want it to be simple and easy, and for it to be able to easy to manage, right? But also as you start to engage your different risk stakeholders, the owners, for example, it's empowering for them to be able to actually see the risks that they own or the controls that they own, to understand what is the state, what are the items that I have to remediate. So ServiceNow is really good at really connecting that user experience for those different stakeholders, so that you can shift to have that more risk-aware culture by embedding risk into everyday workflows, where people might not even know that they're doing something related to risk, but they know that they are managing or supporting or providing information that'll help the organization more broadly. As we start to think through that crawl, walk, run with any program around risk, you can start to I'm sure you kind of started thinking about what that next phase might look like. And so we often see customers start shifting into more continuous monitoring of risks and controls. Of course, it's great to be able to send out risk assessments and engage stakeholders, but when we want to think through securing our organization, the more that we can do to be more proactive instead of reactive is going to help. So if you can start to continuously monitor those risks and monitor those controls, you can identify if there's any gaps, or if your risk scores are increasing, or if there's been a spike in something like vulnerabilities that could impact your risk scores, right? You want to be able to catch that in near real time so that you can remediate that, and not months down the line when maybe it's a little bit too late and there's already been some detriment or a negative impact to the organization. So thinking through what that maturity could look like by introducing more continuous monitoring and automation. We talked a little bit about contextualizing risk for business stakeholders. So not only actually engaging them in a way that's easy for them, but what about being able to give them insight into the status of those risks? Of course, that's going to be important. And then finally, to be able to connect and manage risk and compliance through tools of an automation. Let me ask you this. Imagine that, as a stakeholder, you were able to receive not maybe an email notification or a Teams notification. Maybe you don't actually do risk assessments or control assessments very often, once a year or twice a year. So you receive this notification through the tools you're already using, email, Teams, what have you. And there's a link that brings you directly to the assessment, and the assessment has information for you about what were the recent results. Are there any open issues? What's the guidance? How do you actually go through this assessment? And if you had any questions, what if you could actually connect directly to that risk team that's sending out these assessments? So the more that we can really connect risk across the organization by using tools that you exist and allow ServiceNow to be that system of action, that allows you again to shift more towards that risk-aware culture and also set you up for success in terms of maturing your program and introducing more automation. Now, as you think through what risk assessments look like today across your enterprise, important to understand that there's many different types of risk assessments that could be happening. Either your group might actually be doing a couple of different types of risk assessments, or perhaps the different risk groups might. So, Blurda, can you tell us a little bit more about what that could look like from a ServiceNow perspective?
Yeah, definitely. And before we delve into the examples that we have prepared for the webinar today, we want to set the scene of what risk assessments are, what you can do with, what's the art of possible within ServiceNow with risk assessment and how you can span those across enterprise. So ServiceNow offers a very flexible framework when it comes to risk assessments. So it can enable the organizations to effectively manage all types of assessment across the enterprise. So as you can see here, you can have different type of assessment that's currently are in the screen. Hence, this, with risk assessments, you have that comprehensive suite of features that can provide the centralized management and configurable methodologies to enable organizations to align and optimize the assessment process for different risk domain, compliance requirements, and different industry standards. So hence, that's why with the advanced risk assessment that we have within ServiceNow, we provide that flexibility where you can define multiple risk assessment methodologies, and each one can have its own set of factors, its own scoring logic and rating criteria. So when it comes to, risk and control self-assessments and process risk assessment, application risk assessment, you can define how those assessments are going to look like. You can define their factors, the scoring logic, the rating, their metrics is maybe your operational risk one can look 5 by 5, while your application risk one or process risk one matrix is a 3 by 3. So this is the difference and the flexibility that you have in ServiceNow, because you can assess a type of risk, let's say operational risk, and you can delve into the details like factor levels to evaluate the associated risk. On the other hand, if you evaluate something else like application risk or project risk, you can have a different set of factors that may be considered to measure the level of risk accurately. Hence, the flexibility, if the flexibility is there, not only you can do that for risk, but if you, for example, you want to have the ability to assess risk with any sort of objects, let's say a new regulation is coming, you want to know what's the impact. This is where you can do object risk assessment rather than just doing risk-based assessment when you delve into the granular level of risk within the organization. Hence, that's it allows you to assess, different areas of the organization that can be risk associated with a particular business unit, with a particular division or business application, or it can be with a specific area, like, as I mentioned, a project, a regulatory requirement, an exception, if you want to measure the impact and the risk that might have. And if we move down, Stephanie, then we should be able to see factors as well. So factors are an essential component of any risk assessment. What does that mean? It's basically the piece that you have to capture the information. So like simply putting this here, if consists of questions and the corresponding responses that you will provide during the risk assessment process. So these factors can either be answered manually, such as, for example, what is the financial, what is the legal, or what is the reputational impact of the risk, or automatically through automated risk factors. So what are those? Those can be number of open vulnerabilities for an asset. If you do those, application risk assessment, revenue of the business, number of certain requests, and so on. So this is where absolutely you can move from doing those manual assessment to completely data-driven assessment. So you can automate parts, or you can automate the whole process of risk assessments. If you, for example, let's say you had your controls already assessed by different teams, and those controls are being used to mitigate the risk your own and you're currently assessing, rather than assuming that controls are effective, you have this information coming automatically from the teams that own the control, and you can use it to fully automate your control and residual environments. This is what we want to show later on in one of the examples, how you can leverage data that you already have in the platform as the evidence of the control or residual assessment that you're going to be performing. So the shift towards data-driven assessment and automation will empower organizations to improve risk management practices, because this can enhance the decision making. You have the data as your evidence. You can have a real-time view on your risk program and control program, because you're continuously monitoring your risks and your controls. And rather than being reactive, you can be very proactive when it comes to manage risk and controls. So later on, we will show two examples. One of them is going to be half automated, and the other one is going to be fully automated, how you can be very proactive when it comes to manage certain risks that you have within the organization. And if we move to the next slides, before we just jump to the examples, we do have the key features just for you to see here. What are the key features of advanced risk assessment? I already mentioned that you can have multiple assessment methodologies for different type of risk and different type of objects that you have within the organization. You can combine manual and automated assessment to assess risk. So like, some organization might not be there yet, but they can start like small, like having some automation in some of their risk assessment. It's highly configurable. Everything that you do on these advanced risk assessment is something that you can configure. And all the features of the risk assessment, essentially, like, just assessing the risk is like, you can assess the risk qualitatively. You can do that quantitatively as well. You can define how the risk roll up is going to look like, if you want, like, average, minimize, maximize. So that automatically, while you're assessing the risk, you can see how this is affecting the risk hierarchy and risk taxonomy and your business hierarchy as well. And then lately on, we've released the risk appetite feature as well, where you can basically, while assessing the risk, you can see if you're impacting your, the thresholds that you've set up for your appetite and tolerances that you have around certain types of risks. So
Laura,
now,
speaking of that roll up that you're defining, we have a couple of questions in the chat. One of them is actually asking around that risk roll up that you were just speaking to, and how from like an organizational perspective, how people can actually see their overall risk posture across their organization, even though maybe today risk roll up is happening within a specific risk assessment methodology, or maybe they have a few different methodologies.
Yeah, and when you have different methodologies, and let's say you're using same risks and you have different methodologies, you have a drop down when you can basically select which methodology you want. For example, let's say you have one for operational risk. You can see with operational risk how you assess risk, you're scoring certain way. But if you have, another methodology that basically you've used that risk, or that risk is being assessed with that methodology as well, you should be able to, through the drop down that you have on a certain risk or on a certain organizational unit, to see the level of the risks that you have there.
Absolutely. We had another question just on that screen that had all the different risk assessments. One question about where is the third-party risk assessments?
If not sure if like what it meant by third-party risk assessment, if it's the inherent third-party risk assessment or the tiering assessment meant here, but basically this is something that when you can definitely use the same technology to do the third-party risk assessment for if you want to define the inherent risk or in risk-based areas. Because as mentioned earlier, you can basically use object risk assessment rather than risk assessments to do this type of assessments.
Awesome. All right, so in terms of the demonstration for today, there's two key use cases that we'd like to show you. And the first one is going to be more around the data-driven assessments. The second one is going to be what the experience could look like in terms of what we would call a frictionless assessment. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the demonstration. Now, in terms of any of those stakeholders that might be coming in and supporting you, we talked a little bit about shifting to that risk-aware culture. What we're looking at here is the employee center portal. So you're probably familiar with ServiceNow already. If it's a place that you might go to submit something like an IT ticket or a request, there you can actually enable components of risk and compliance in that same portal. And what that allows is for your different stakeholders to be engaged and to have that one-stop shop to be able to complete things like risk assessments, issue remediations, risk response tasks, for example, control attestations, and more. Now, if we look through an example of a specific risk assessment here, I want to take you through the experience of what it would be like to complete this. So in this example, we've sent a risk assessment to one of our stakeholders or owners. And so they would receive a notification, maybe that's by email or through Teams, for example. The notification will bring them directly to the portal to kick off their risk assessment. So right off the bat, they can either click to get started. If you want, you can enable them to assign these out, reassign them, or even to be able to review the previous results. Now let's go ahead and click to get started. I'm going to actually copy over the previous assessment example here. Just as a note, this is a configuration change. And when we speak about configuration, we mean like there's drop downs, options, drag and drop interfaces. You know, particularly for this one, it's a checkbox. Do you want to allow them to copy over? So you don't need to know how to code. Everything in ServiceNow is going to be no code or no code, low code, and really is a simple experience. So taking a look at this risk assessment, we're going to actually copy over those results here. Okay. Now, as this loads up, let me just refresh and make sure I'm still signed on here. Give me one moment. I've had my tab open for just a couple of minutes, so I want to make sure that this is still logged in. As this loads, I think it's important to understand that when it comes to like defining your risk assessments, as you saw from what Blurta was showing, there's different ways that you can set up your risk assessment methodology. And configuring that is also very easy in terms of selecting checkboxes and whatnot. So here's an example of a risk assessment. In this case, we're starting off with the inherent assessment, then we'll move into the control assessment, the residual, and then the response task. Now, when we talk about how configurable this is, you can absolutely turn on or off these different phases, depending on the type of risk assessment you're doing, whether we just care about the inherent or if we want to do maybe a full RCSA. You also have full abilities to adjust the different factors. So in this example, we're looking at a simple impact and likelihood, and we're actually using a 4-point scale. Again, you can adjust the point scale, the options. You can provide guidance for the stakeholders so that they understand What does it mean to have low versus high impact? And then as well, the actual factors itself you can define. So some customers will do impact and likelihood. Others might have 5 factors for impact that rolls into their over impact. So really, it's an opportunity to kind of match your process and bring that into ServiceNow in terms of how you're conducting your risk assessment today. Now, as a stakeholder who's coming in here, I have a lot of contextual information to help me as I'm going through and completing this assessment. So I can actually see on the right-hand side some reference information. How many issues do we currently have open for risk? Are there any risk events that are currently raised? If you're tracking any key risk indicators, have there been any breaches or have you crossed any of those thresholds? And of course, all of this information, you can actually drill down. So if I wanted to double click into one of these items, I could actually see what is the open issue for this risk. And that's going to help me understand what does this environment look like so that I can provide these responses to the best of my knowledge without having to swivel chair, while I can have all this information in one place. Now, as we complete our impact and our likelihood, the solution is going to automatically score these results based on the calculation that you've inputted. So again, you can use a simple calculation, an average, or what have you, or you can actually get a little bit more complex. It's really up to you. And if ever they need to override a particular score here, they absolutely can change those computed scores and provide their justification or comments. Now, as we move past the inherent assessment, you'll notice that in the control assessment, again, we have a lot of contextual information. So firstly, in the middle here, I can actually see what are the mitigating controls that are currently mapped to my risk. And also, what is the status of whether they are compliant or not? Sometimes these control tests are actually being done by a different person. So if that's the case, I can actually get that information, see what the status is. If I need to, I can actually click to open up that control specifically and see why the status is compliant or non-compliant. But also, I don't even need to necessarily drill in, because all that information here, how many issues are open for these controls, or what were the results of those control tests, we can actually see that being surfaced right here on that screen. When it comes to doing your, if the control assessment is kind of being done separately to this, you'll notice that the factors for our control effectiveness are actually getting automatically calculated. This is being defined based on the statuses that you see here. So again, thinking through your maturity of your program, right? Maybe your phase 1 is that somebody is coming in, they're reviewing the results, they need to actually input what they believe that control effectiveness is. But as your program continues to mature, you can actually leverage more automation in ServiceNow and use the data that exists in the platform, in your organization, to be able to have this type of risk assessment automatically inputted in terms of your control effectiveness. So we really don't even need to input a response here, because the information is already in the solution. Okay. Again, the solution will absolutely compute your control effectiveness as you step through this. And if we need to, we can override with justification. So now, as we move into the residual risk, in this example here, everything is going to be automated as well. Of course, depending on your methodology, if you needed to have actual factors here for your residual assessment, you can. But in this case, in thinking through that maturity again, if that data already exists in the organization, if we can automate it and have some of these scores calculated for us, that's where we're going to be able to ensure that we're getting more clear and that we're actually capturing information, doing these calculations appropriately, and that we're saving some time and efforts in terms of someone, kind of going through a residual when we already have the information of the inherent and the control effectiveness here. Moving into that last phase over here is where we can start to define our risk response. So how do we want to work through this? Do we want to accept it, mitigate, avoid, or transfer it? What happens when we select our risk response is it actually creates a task here. So for this particular task, we can actually make sure that this gets assigned to a plan, that we see that there's an owner and a priority, and this becomes a task that we can start to track as we move through and actually remediate or mitigate or conduct our risk acceptance as part of this as well. Okay, so this is one example of a risk assessment that we have here. There's different ways, again, that you can set up your risk assessment methodology. And if I just take a quick look back to our tasks here as well, you'll notice that I, as a user, have a few different risk assessments. So, there's different ways that you can start to set this up in terms of completing this. Maybe we want to take a look at another example here for a different risk about unauthorized trading. You can actually start to define what those different risk assessments look like. Okay. All right, so that takes us through our first example. Blurta, I'll pause here just to see if there's anything else that you think would be important to add before we move on from here.
Sorry, classic, and I was in mute. No, I think that's basically covered, the first example of how when you have the example when second line is triggering those assessments, and then someone from the first line has this on this unified task view, completes, has the data as evidence to support the assessment. And also we saw the case of if those controls are already being tested and evaluated from different areas or different teams in the organization, you can have that information coming automatically, and you can agree with the results. You can always have the option to override, but essentially it's coming. So already someone else in the organization have tested it, and you can leverage that information to drive automation in your assessment. So this was the example of those half automated risk assessment. And there are areas where you can drive automation, and we were able to show that automation in the control and the residual environment. What I will be doing now, I will be doing something that's completely automatic, and something that when first line is logging into their computer and doing their daily activity tasks, they would basically submitting requests without being aware that they're actually contributing in the overall risk and compliance management piece. I know that there are a lot of questions in the chat as well. We'll be trying to answer those, but let me jump on the second example first, and then we can try to answer everything at the end. So I'll be taking the screen now. So if we show this first before we jump into the platform, this is basically us showing how risk can be part of the everyday work from everyone. So there are activities that we do perform, but actually we are unaware of how this sort of the invisible risk that's being performed, or the automation that's going to be we are going to use to drive some of the activities. For example, when we log into the PC, we change our password, we actually have a control update or a control requirement that says that the password has to be changed every 90 days. So us changing the password, it's actually making that control be compliant. Or do we have we have other examples that actually are something that we do within the day, and we don't know that they're actually an invisible area that we don't see that manages or affects the risk and control environment. What I'm going to do today, I'm basically going to show like how I'm going to raise a gift request. Like basically, I've received a request from a supplier. I know that it's a policy organization. Our organization has a policy that everything that I receive, I need to go in and input that information in a form intake that we have somewhere in our portal that we use for everything. But what I'm unaware of, there is like there are thresholds within our risk environment that we should not go over this certain value. That's something that I will be showing in this demonstration, how exactly that works. So if I go in and I basically impersonate like an employee, I'm impersonating Cyril here. Here it's the same portal that Stephanie was showing earlier, but basically has everything ServiceNow related. So what I'm doing here, I'm basically looking at the going back to this one, looking at like all the things that I can do in the Employee Center. I know that I need to go in and register requests through a gift that I've just received. So I go into the legal one. I can look. There is like gifts and meals. A request here, so like I can go in and I can start initiating this request. So like once here I can look at the description of what this request is, and I can see like I'm requesting it, what's the purpose of this, and then I can start making the changes. So the information. So before I do this, I just want to show that now if I just switch back from second line perspective, just to show you this. In the second line, I do have this dashboard. I do have all suppliers. I can see all suppliers, like, what's the gift value per supplier that I have, because I do have some risk and controls that I've set up that we should not go through a certain threshold on the things, like, when we accept gifts. So like this is, you can see we have a Acme here that's almost 5,000, and we have other suppliers as well. And we have a list of all the employees and the total gifts values that every employee has registered. If I just go in the risk side, when I manage risk, I do have a methodology where I actually can look at, supplier risk that I have. So if I look at and I open this one, I just want to show, how this methodology looks like. So I will essentially, I will have this heat map, and the heat map I will see like exactly where all sort of like, the risk that I have, where exactly every supplier sits in. This is inherent risk, so this is without having the controls in place. So if I look the ones when we have the controls in place, I'll see that everything is like, in either medium or low. So like I don't have anything that I should maybe start actioning it. So if I look at, like, for example, the supplier SME here, I look at this, I can see the details about this. I can see where exactly this sits. That's the supplier. If I want to look at exactly, the information on the supplier and like what are the sort of controls that we are basically using to mitigate the risk for this supplier, we can look at this. When I go to the controls, I should be able to see, what are those controls and like what are the sort of measurement mechanism that we're using to monitor this risk. So if I just refresh this. So this is where I want to show that we have this risk, and we have two controls that we basically are using to mitigate the risk. This in here.
And Blorda, while this is loading, just a quick question on, how out of the box is everything that we're going through and that we're showing today in the solution in terms of the risk assessments, but also in terms of like the workflow that we're taking a look for the second use case.
So basically, I would say that those are out of the box. Obviously, you would define your methodologies, and I guess we've used the methodology with automated factors. That's something that you would need to build, because like you would need to tell the platform what sort of factors you're going to use to mitigate, for example, that risk. Hence, that's something that you would need to additionally configure from what's there out of the box.
Right. And then just while you're talking about automated factors, there was a question around if that's available with enterprise packages. So yes, automated factors specifically are available with enterprise packages, but the manual factors are going to be available with the professional level.
Yeah, so like here, so I'm able to see the supplier is Acme in this case, and I can see this supplier has two controls, and these controls are like the number. The supplier must not have more than 5,000 in gifts over the last 12 years, or the number of employees should not receive more than 2,000 euros in gifts in the last 12 months. So we do have these sort of controls that are mitigating this risk. And if you look at the controls level as well, you can look at like how we are mitigating the risk. So like this is a control. We have a mechanism of an indicator. We can see that the last time has passed. So we have the information on this is basically how the system is looking, is surfing for information, is looking at this information. So every time that we've looked at this, because we have a daily job that looks at the data into the platform, we've seen that everything was like under 5,000. Hence, we have not breached any thresholds, and the controls are compliant. Hence, that's why when we look at this specific supplier Acme, when it comes to the residual risk, we see that this is actually placed at medium rather than being like somewhere even that the inherent risk was critical. So this is I wanted to show first before we jump in, and we show like after we make a change, and we're actually for the Acme we put like something that goes over the threshold that we've set up. How does this actually affect our risk and compliance environment? So if I go into the first line, I'm going into here. I'm just saying like, what's the purpose of disclosure? I'm just saying that actually I'm receiving a gift, and then I can basically look at the supplier in here, find which is the supplier. I can provide the details in here. And I can say the total in value, for example, is 500. And then let's say that it's and then once I submit this, like this information should get updated within the system. So like if I go back into the previous screen where I was in, and I was seeing like almost like 4,000 and something, like I can see that now is over 5,000. So like what the system will do in this time was like based on the job frequency of like how we set up, like how frequently we want to monitor the controls and we monitor the risk. We'll look at the data. We'll look at like if they're now, instead of having the value that we just saw earlier that was like under 4,000, if we do have the same value, or this actually has changed because we do have data that supports that we've gone over the threshold. So like so this is something that how you would set up automation in place, because you can basically put the automation, put jobs in place to say, I want to look at this, let's say every hour or every day based on the frequencies that you want to provide. And the system based on those frequencies will look at your controls, will look at the risks, and will look at like, if you've made, that's sort of, you breach the thresholds that you've added for your controls. And essentially, if your controls that you're using to mitigate that risk are failing, it means that your risk posture, for that specific vendor will fail as well. Are there any questions, Stephanie, we need to answer before we jump into the second part of this demonstration?
Yeah, there's a couple of general questions with regards to the assessment and the heat map. So you were just showing the heat map workbench. So Lisa has a question. Can you use the heat map workbench to analyze risks with IT change requests?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, can you use the heat map workbench that we were looking at? Can you use that to analyze risks with IT change requests?
Definitely. Like, I mean, you would have those, I would assume you would have those risks, and those risks could be linked at IT assets. And basically you can use the risk heat map based on the factors that you've set up. And you can see the trending, you can see the analysis, or like, how the risk is trending, how you're mitigating the risk, where this risk exactly sits. You would be defining the methodologies around, that type of risks.
Awesome. And then in terms of the risk assessments, can they be triggered automatically based on like a condition set?
Yeah, so basically this is what I'm doing right now. Those assessments are like the assessment that that's currently for the suppliers. There is a job that runs that will trigger this, and then you can define the criteria of when that job should run. So, and basically however that criteria is, that will mean that it will run in that defined criteria.
Awesome, thanks for that.
Okay, so like now what I want to show is basically the same heat map that I was showing earlier, but now the difference is that I do have the Acme supplier in the red. And why it's in the red? It's because we know that we had a control that measures looks at the threshold data that we have, and that basically because that control has failed, the risk assessment, the automatic risk assessment that we have in place for the suppliers have gathered that information. And now instead of having this residual risk at low level or medium level, we have it at high level because our controls have failed. So, and then this is where it comes, when you can drive that sort of automation and you can say, look at my data, not necessarily that those data will be controls. It can be something that's across the platform, the example I just took with gifts. And then you can create your own methodologies on how you want to automatically assess the risk. So now you can see the control that previously was in compliance. Now, actually, this control is non-compliant. So if I go and have a look at this control, I should be able to see that the information that we have actually has failed. The indicator has failed, and why this has failed. If I look at this information, it will show that the previous state was passed, but this actually the last time that this was run, it has failed. And the reason that it has failed is because this has gone over the 5,000 threshold that we've set up in place. So you were able to see that without me doing nothing, I just entered a gift request like someone from the first line would do. The system was able to recognize the change, look at, monitor the controls continuously, look at if the control has, the control that mitigates the risk is on the threshold that it should be. In the moment that this threshold was over, the control automatically is non-compliant and the risk changes status as well. So this was the second example that we wanted to show that it's completely automated.
So Blurta, for this one, while this is completely automated, if someone wanted to change the frequency of collection, or in fact, maybe they just wanted to run it on an ad hoc basis, is that something we can do?
That's completely I can either click execute here and run in the ad hoc basis, but this approach would be rather reactive than proactive. If you allow, you say you want to look at this daily, that's the frequency that you want to look as we have it in here. The system will look daily if any changes in the data, you had any changes in the data, and if those changes are actually within the thresholds that you've set up as risk and compliance.
Great. And then just in terms of the values, if there are values in another table, whether we're looking at that control evaluation that you were just showing, or we're talking more from a quantitative assessment that we might be doing, can you refer to values or data that might exist in another table to support these workflows?
Yeah, and definitely that's the integrated approach, because you can leverage the platform, the data that you have in the platform, but we recognize that some of the data might not be even in ServiceNow platform. So with advanced risk assessment, you can gather that data, integrate with the other platforms that you have, and then bring the data in ServiceNow to have automatically, some of these metrics or indicators coming up as well. So that should not, if you don't have the data in ServiceNow, that should not limit to have automation as well, as long as you identify where the data that you need to support that assessment relies on.
Awesome, thank you.
Do we have more questions, Stephanie?
Those were the key ones. There was one response back just in terms of the risk responses, where maybe the risk owner and the risk assessor are different personas, and whether we can support that. I think the initial question was related to the response tasks, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that question before, and I think I've said that you can decide who should be assessing the risk, and now I can see that actually they have a different risk owner, a different risk assessor in their approaches, but still, I would say that if you don't have a risk assessor, but actually the risk owner is the risk assessor, you can automatically, whenever you create those risks, you can automatically say whoever is the owner of the risk is the assessor of this risk as well. So basically, it's essentially the same persona. I think we have left both there to allow for flexibility for organizations that they may have different personas when it comes to owning the risk and assessing the risk. But if you have the same persona, you can automatically assign whoever is the owner to be the assessor as well.
Awesome, thanks.
Perfect. I think we're on time. So thanks everyone for joining. I hope this session was helpful. You can always reach to us for if you have any questions, or if you want to know more about what we've shown today. We're happy to answer all your questions.
So if you have any other questions, feel free to pop those into the chat. Just while we give you a couple of minutes to type in any last minute questions here, perhaps we'll just do a quick recap on what we saw in terms of like the solution and the value here. So just sharing my screen. Really, we were taking a look at how you can start to do those risk assessments and set them up to move more into an automated flow. Of course, we recognize that there's like a journey that you go through, and that, many organizations that we speak with might still be in that kind of more manual phase, and that's okay. But thinking through what that maturity could look like for you, so that you can start to get the value and benefits out of streamlining this, right? To be able to actually have that single solution where everything is in one place so that you don't have to swivel chair. We saw that available in the risk assessments, where you have that contextual information, for example. We talked about a unified view to eliminate silos. There's different ways to report. We saw the risk heat map as an example, and you can actually enable a lot of those reports through the portal for your owners as well, if you are looking to shift to that more ownership from the owners and get to that more risk-aware culture. In terms of modernizing communication and collaboration, the risk assessment really does have that opportunity to capture comments and to be able to communicate back and forth. If they have any questions, and to make it a little bit easier, just so that we can ensure that, we're reducing potential delays, or that, in case people might be inputting information that could actually impact what our reporting is, and see if there's any costly mistakes. And then finally, all of that is going to be happening in real time. So the more that you can leverage data that exists within your organization to support in some of those assessments that you're doing, whether it's looking at, that gift workflow where we have information coming in, and then that actually triggers, whether our control is effective or not. And then even how that feeds into the risk assessment, right? By introducing more automation there, that's what's going to give you more of that real-time reporting and tracking so that you can actually make decisions on the data you have today and not on the data that you had from a month or two ago. So with that, we'll take a look to see if there's any last minute questions here in the Q&A.
I think we have one around if control assessment results in a non-compliance or issue finding, say months after the risk assessment is conducted, will the risk automatically be adjusted? So if you've set up let's say a job that will continuously look if there is a change in your risk and control environment, yes, that would be automatically adjusted. If not, you can always, when there is a change that has affected the control, there can be a notification sent to the risk owner, then they should run an ad hoc risk assessment. So these are the possible options you can have if you don't, continuously set up monitoring for the risk.
Awesome.
For the YouTube video, I think usually it's a day or 2 days after the webinar is done, so they can just upload it. So I think latest it should be this Friday.
Great. I see there's also questions around documentation on how to automatically trigger risk assessments. Blurta, do you have any ideas, or do we know if we have a specific doc on that, or what would be the best way to kind of support that question around how to get more information on triggering risk assessments automatically?
I think that, that's more like a platform feature as well. So basically the way of how you can, that's definitely, it's a job. And then you would just say I want this assessment to be triggered in case I have a change in the control, or in case I have basically on the criteria. Not sure if there's how, there should be documentation online, but how good this documentation is, I can't answer this at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah, I think that's a good one to take a look at, and perhaps also your ServiceNow team may also be helpful, just in terms of because they're probably familiar as well with different ways to support that too. So I would also recommend chatting with your ServiceNow team. And then another question about if there's any KB pointers that are helpful.
It's KB knowledge-based articles that are helpful. Okay.
Yeah, we can take a look. It might be worth doing a quick search within there. I guess in terms of the documentation we have, there's a few different pages about the indicators, for example. So we looked at the control indicators. There's also some interesting documentation around the risk assessment factors and the different options that you have for that as well. And of course, there's definitely other topics just depending on where specifically you want to take a look at. But in terms of what might be helpful from what we saw today, probably taking a look at the risk assessment methodology and the different risk factors would be good. And then around the key risk indicators or key control indicators. Cool. All right. I think with that, looks like we've gone through all the questions. Feel free to connect with us. Here's a few ways that you absolutely can. As Blurta mentioned, we will be posting this recording as well. And other than that, just want to say thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, everyone.